Hey guys, tonight we're settling into the long, strange saga of the Habsburgs, the royal house whose centuries of marrying within their own bloodline both built their empire and slowly sealed its downfall. It's a tale stuffed with crowns, castles, royal weddings and jawlines so pronounced they could practically score glass. The Habsburgs were the dynasty that spent generation after generation marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, and now and then someone who happened to be all three at once on a single branch of the family tree. Before we go further, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these odd little wanderings through the past. And if you happen to be one of the people who suggested this subject, thank you, because ideas like yours shape these stories more than you'd guess. While you're down there, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the hour is for you. There always seems to be somebody out there tuning in at 2017 in the morning, quietly puzzling over why medieval kings considered marrying a second cousin a thoroughly sensible romantic plan. So let's get curious for a moment. Have you ever wondered what unfolds when the mightiest families in Europe decide that the surest way to hold on to power is to marry one another? What might it have been like to grow up in a palace where the family tree resembled less a tree and more a knotted rope? Could anyone survive a royal upbringing where half the relatives also happened to be cousins, great uncles, and in certain cases both? What happens when wave after wave of kings and queens insist the bloodline must stay pure, even as the results begin to look a little peculiar? Would you still feel regal if your jaw had grown so large that chewing dinner became a struggle? Would ruling Europe hold much appeal if half your court murmured that the royal family was quietly becoming a medical riddle? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how did a single dynasty manage to govern half the world while producing some of the most famously unusual faces in human history? Tonight, all of that comes clear. Because congratulations, you've just opened your eyes in a Habsburg palace in the early 1500s. Your parents are related. Your grandparents are related. Your great-grandparents were related too. And unfortunately, the family wedding invitations are about to grow rather awkward. So let's begin. You wake inside a palace that answers to no single kingdom. It answers to many. Spain, Austria, stretches of Italy, the Netherlands, and a good half of Europe all seem to bow to one name, Habsburg. The dynasty's motto might as well have read, simple and efficient, let other people bleed in their wars. We'll simply marry their daughters instead. Through one carefully chosen union after another, the Habsburgs quietly sewed together one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. Sadly, they also sewed together something else, a thoroughly tangled family tree. You sit up in your vast bed, swaddled in velvet blankets that likely cost more than an entire village earns across a decade. Beyond your window, church bells ring out over a city that technically belongs to you, or at least to your relatives, which in the Habsburg world amounts to much the same thing. Here's the trick of it. The Habsburg dynasty doesn't seize Europe the way most empires do. They don't drive endless armies across muddy fields season after season. They don't forever storm castles or set cities alight. No, the Habsburgs stumbled onto something far more efficient. Marriage. In truth, the family slogan might as well be that famous line historians so love to repeat. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. It sounds rather romantic until you realize the strategy turns the whole continent into the world's most complicated wedding reception. Picture it for a moment. A princess from Spain marries an Austrian archduke. Their son weds a cousin from another limb of the family. That cousin's sister marries into the Netherlands. Before long, entire countries start appearing on the Habsburg family tree like surprise guests who never quite leave. Soon enough, you're no longer ruling a single kingdom. You're ruling several. Spain, that one's yours. Austria, also yours. Wide swaths of Italy, why not? The Low Countries, sure, toss those in as well. It's rather like inheriting half a continent through a string of deeply awkward family dinners. And the finest part, no battlefield required. While rival royal houses wear themselves thin in endless wars, the Habsburgs busy themselves arranging weddings, signing marriage contracts, and posting courteous letters that essentially announce, "Congratulations, we're related now, so your kingdom belongs to us." Of course, this clever plan carries one small side effect. When you keep marrying inside the same royal circles over and over, the pool of available relatives starts to shrink. At first, it hardly matters. The royal families of Europe were all somewhat connected anyway. Cousin marriages were common. Nobody much raised an eyebrow. But with the Habsburgs, the habit grew downright eager. A cousin here, another cousin there, an uncle and niece every so often. Nothing too strange for the age, at least on a first glance, except that generation after generation kept repeating the pattern, and slowly, quietly, the family tree began doing something curious. Rather than branching outward like a healthy oak, it started folding back on itself like a very bewildered pretzel. If you could spread the Habsburg genealogy across a tabletop, it would look less like a tree and more like something someone had accidentally tied into a knot. The same names surface again and again. The same ancestors keep returning. Grandparents appear twice, sometimes 3 times over. At royal weddings, half the guests are already related before the ceremony even begins. Which means that, while the Habsburgs are happily gathering kingdoms like polished trophies, they're also doing something else without quite noticing. They're slowly turning their dynasty into Europe's most exclusive family club. Entry requirements, noble blood, a royal title, and ideally being somebody's cousin. And this approach, dazzling as it seems in the moment, is going to steer the fate of the entire dynasty for centuries to come. But for now, as you step into the candlelit halls of your palace and servants bow politely as you pass, everything has the look of success. Your family rules half of Europe. Your dynasty appears unstoppable. Your relatives occupy more thrones than anyone can comfortably count. What could possibly go wrong with a family plan built almost entirely on marrying one another? Well, you're about to find out. Let's talk about courtship in the Habsburg family. Most royal houses tried to forge alliances through marriage. The Habsburgs took that notion and made it a whole way of life. Rather than constantly marrying into fresh families, they tended to glance around at their own relations and decide, close enough. Cousin marriages turned routine. Uncles wed nieces. Dynastic power stayed tidily within the same genetic circle. Politically, it was brilliant. Biologically, rather less so. Now imagine you're a royal advisor in the Habsburg court. Your task isn't to plan campaigns or drill soldiers. Your task is to arrange weddings. Endless weddings. Somewhere in a candlelit chamber ringed with maps and family charts that increasingly resemble a bowl of tangled noodles, you and a knot of very solemn-looking diplomats are debating the future of Europe. Not through war, but through engagement announcements. You point at Spain. Someone else points at Austria. Another advisor unfurls a scroll and notes that a certain archduke happens to have a daughter who is technically available and only mildly related to the young prince in question. Everyone nods gravely. Yes, splendid. Another fine match. Because from the Habsburg point of view, the aim is simple: keep power inside the family. If your daughter marries into some other royal house, that's pleasant enough, but it means a rival family gains a foothold. Their children might inherit something that once belonged to you. Whereas, if your daughter marries her cousin, well, that's practically a corporate merger. The kingdoms stay in the same hands. The titles remain safely within the dynasty. The land doesn't wander off to strangers with suspiciously unfamiliar surnames. It's the royal equivalent of saying, let's keep this business in the family. And at first, it works beautifully. Across the 1500s and 1600s, the Habsburgs become the supreme collectors of crowns. Spain, Austria, Hungary, parts of Italy, the Low Countries. One after another, territories drift into their orbit like iron filings pulled toward a magnet, all thanks to carefully arranged marriages. Which, if you happen to be a young Habsburg prince or princess, means your romantic life is about as spontaneous as a tax audit. You're not catching someone's eye at a dance and tumbling into love. You're being introduced to a relative over a diplomatic dinner while several ambassadors quietly tally the geopolitical fallout of your future children. Someone clears their throat. This is your cousin. Another voice adds, quite optimistically, a distant cousin. And just like that, the court starts planning the wedding. To be fair, cousin marriage wasn't unusual among European royalty. Dynasties everywhere did it now and then. The goal was always the same: to preserve alliances, wealth, and influence. But the Habsburgs embraced the idea with remarkable enthusiasm. Generation after generation carried on the pattern. Cousin marriages became ordinary. Uncle and niece marriages cropped up more often. The circle slowly drew tighter. And because the dynasty was so mighty, fewer and fewer families counted as suitable matches. Royal blood, after all, had to stay pure, which kept the list of acceptable spouses very short indeed. Conveniently, most of those acceptable spouses already happened to be seated at the same dinner table. Now, at this stretch of history, nobody understands genetics. The science simply doesn't exist yet. There are no diagrams explaining recessive traits or inherited conditions. From where the Habsburg court stands, the strategy makes perfect sense. Hold the empire together. Keep the bloodline strong. Keep the crowns within the same dynasty. Simple, efficient, even brilliant. Except a small trouble is quietly building in the background. Each time the family tree loops back upon itself, certain traits grow more likely to surface. At first the shifts are subtle, a faintly familiar facial shape here, a similar chin there, nothing too alarming. But as the generations roll on, the family resemblance becomes unmistakable. Portrait painters begin to notice it. Court physicians begin murmuring about odd health troubles. And historians centuries down the line will look back on the Habsburg marriage strategy and call it one of the most ambitious dynastic schemes ever attempted. A scheme that managed to unite half of Europe and, almost by accident, produced one of the most famous family resemblances in all of human history. But for now, in your candle-lit palace, surrounded by advisors cheerfully planning yet another royal wedding, it all still feels like a brilliant idea. After all, what could possibly go wrong with marrying your cousin again and again and again? Your story really begins with Emperor Maximilian I, a man who grasped something rather clever. Wars were costly, but weddings came cheap. Instead of conquering territory with armies, Maximilian preferred to conquer it with marriage contracts. His celebrated strategy reshaped Europe through carefully arranged unions. Yet while he was assembling an empire through matrimony, he was also laying the groundwork for centuries of ever more complicated family ties. Picture yourself standing in Maximilian's court sometime in the late 1400s. The room smells faintly of candle wax, parchment, and the slow-burning anxiety of European politics. Maps of the continent lie spread across heavy wooden tables, and every one of them looks less like geography and more like an opportunity. Maximilian isn't poring over battle plans, he's poring over family trees. Because while most rulers of the age are busy sharpening swords and marching armies across muddy fields, Maximilian has hit upon something far more efficient: marriage. Armies are expensive. Soldiers need food, weapons, horses, and occasionally wages. Wars drag on for years, sometimes decades. And even if victory comes, there are still restless provinces to govern and irritated neighbours to placate. A wedding, though, is courteous. A wedding is diplomatic. A wedding arrives with cake, with music, and with a legally binding contract that might quietly hand over half a kingdom to your dynasty. It is conquest dressed up with finer table settings, and Maximilian, to give him his due, has a real talent for it. In 1477 he weds Mary of Burgundy, among the wealthiest heiresses anywhere in Europe. That one marriage abruptly draws vast territories into the Habsburg sphere, including the prosperous Low Countries. Towns such as Brussels, Antwerp and Ghent, bustling trade centres thick with merchants and ships, now drift into the widening Habsburg orbit, all because of a single carefully arranged wedding. It is easy to picture Maximilian leaning back afterward, surveying the map of Europe, and concluding that the approach had worked rather nicely. So, of course, he keeps at it. Rather than leaning on warfare to enlarge the dynasty, he sets about arranging marriages for his children with the care of someone playing an exceptionally serious game of international chess. His son Philip marries Joanna of Castile, daughter of the formidable Spanish rulers Ferdinand and Isabella. In an instant, Spain, one of Europe's rising great powers, becomes linked to the Habsburg family, not by invasion, but by in-laws. And just like that, the dynasty secures a foothold in a kingdom that spans the Iberian Peninsula and is on the verge of assembling an enormous overseas empire in the Americas. Which means Maximilian's marriage strategy is no longer merely reshaping Europe. It is about to touch the entire world. In the halls of court, scribes copy out marriage contracts. Ambassadors shuttle between kingdoms bearing proposals, and uneasy young princes and princesses rehearse polite conversation with relatives they may soon be expected to wed. For a member of the Habsburg family, romance is not really the aim, geography is. A future spouse is chosen less for personality and more for which lands happen to come attached. And slowly, quietly, the plan succeeds. By the opening years of the 1500s, the Habsburgs command a staggering assortment of territories. Their kin sit on thrones across many regions. Their reach extends from the Alps to Spain and well beyond, all because a single emperor grasped something simple. Why spend decades waging wars when a wedding invitation will do? There is, naturally, a small catch in building an empire through family ties. The more lands the dynasty gathers through marriage, the more crucial it becomes to keep those lands within the same family, which means the pool of acceptable marriage partners slowly begins to shrink. Keep the circle small enough for long enough, and eventually fresh relatives become hard to find. But that is a worry for later generations. For the moment, Maximilian's strategy looks like sheer brilliance. The empire is growing, the dynasty is flourishing, and Europe is being rearranged one wedding at a time. Soon, Marrying a cousin was not merely common in the Habsburg line, it became the default. Royal courts all over Europe carried tangled family connections, but the Habsburgs pushed it to another level. Generation upon generation married within the same dwindling circle of relatives. Study their family tree today, and historians sometimes joke that it looks less like a tree and more like a ladder. Picture a quiet palace study with a vast parchment chart spread across a table, names spread outward in graceful ink, a tiny crown sketched beside each. At first glance it appears an impressive dynasty. Then something odd surfaces. The branches keep rejoining one another. A cousin here weds another cousin there. A niece marries an uncle. A princess from one branch marries a prince from another branch, who also happens to share several of the same grandparents. Trace the lines far enough and the chart starts curling back on itself, like a medieval maze drawn by someone exceptionally fond of keeping matters within the family. And from the Habsburg point of view, none of this is strange at all. It is, in fact, the plan. The reasoning seems perfectly sound if you are a royal strategist in the 1500s. Your empire now reaches across several kingdoms, and every marriage carries tremendous political weight. Wed your daughter to a rival dynasty, and that family suddenly gains sway over your lands. Their children might inherit territories you spent generations assembling, but marry within the family and the difficulty dissolves. The crowns stay where they belong. The land remains in Habsburg hands. And every new generation tightens the dynasty's hold on Europe. Think of it as a very powerful family business, except that instead of squabbling over who runs the bakery, you are squabbling over who inherits Spain. So the royal matchmakers begin to narrow their search. When a prince comes of marrying age, advisors start working through the list of available candidates. They consider neighbouring dynasties, weigh alliances, measure political gains, and then, almost inevitably, glance back at the family tree. And there they are. Several entirely acceptable cousins. They are already noble. They already carry the right bloodline. Their marriage will not hand power to some questionable foreign house of doubtful loyalty. Honestly, it is simply easier. Before long, cousin marriages become routine. No one gasps. No one lifts an eyebrow. Royal courts across Europe are already knotted with family ties anyway, but the Habsburgs carry the habit further than most. Generation after generation keeps the pattern going. The circle grows tighter, and the family likeness grows stronger. Now, at this point in history, no one understands genetics. The word itself will not exist for centuries. There are no diagrams explaining recessive traits or inherited conditions. What people do notice, though, are resemblances. Royal portraits begin to display the same features turning up over and over. A particular shape of jaw, a particular cast of the face. Courtiers sometimes murmur that a Habsburg could be spotted from across a crowded hall. Even the court painters quietly adjust. Painting a Habsburg ruler, they tilt the head a touch, soften the shadows, and perhaps tweak the lighting so that certain features read as more regal and less memorable. Their task, after all, is not to produce a medical diagram. It is to make the emperor look magnificent. But the resemblance keeps coming back. Each new marriage inside the dynasty reinforces the same pool of inherited traits. The family tree pulls a little tighter, like a knot drawn slowly but steadily closed. And still no one halts because politically the strategy keeps working. The Habsburgs go on ruling immense territories. Their relatives occupy thrones across Europe. Their dynasty seems stronger than ever. From the palace windows, the empire looks stable and glorious. Yet step back and study that peculiar family chart again, the one with all the looping lines and repeating names, and something unsettling starts to emerge. The ladder is narrowing, and everyone climbing it is related. Somewhere along the way, people started noticing something unusual about the family portraits, the chins, the jaws, the faces that seemed permanently tilted forward into history. This distinctive facial structure, known today as the Habsburg jaw, began surfacing again and again across the generations. It grew so recognizable that a Habsburg ruler could often be identified by profile alone. Picture standing in a quiet royal gallery, the air carrying a faint smell of varnish and candle smoke. Portraits run up the walls from floor to ceiling, each set in heavy gold, gazing down with the calm assurance of people who owned whole countries. At first the paintings looked perfectly ordinary. Kings in armor, queens in elaborate gowns, noble poses, regal expressions. But the longer the eye lingers, the more one thing begins to stand out. The chins. Not just one chin, all of them. In portrait after portrait, the same distinctive feature appears, a lower jaw that juts forward slightly, as though the face is leaning into the future ahead of the rest of the body. The lips rest a little apart. The jawline reaches outward just enough to send artists hunting for very strategic lighting. Once it is noticed, it cannot be unnoticed. This is what historians now call the Habsburg jaw, or more formally, mandibular prognathism. It is a genetic trait that causes the lower jaw to project noticeably past the upper jaw. In modern medicine, it is well understood. In the 1500s and 1600s, though, it was simply the family look, and in royal courts the look of a ruler mattered. Portraits were not casual snapshots. They were political statements. When a new king took the throne, his portrait would travel across Europe. Other courts, foreign ambassadors, and prospective marriage partners would all study it. These paintings were meant to convey strength, beauty, and divine authority. So the painters faced a delicate task. On one hand, they had to capture the ruler's likeness closely enough that people recognized him. On the other, they had to keep the emperor from looking as though he could crack a walnut between his teeth. Artists became masters of subtle adjustment. Heads were angled slightly upward. Shadows eased the jawline. Beards appeared more often in certain periods, sometimes helping to disguise the shape of the chin. It was less deception than creative diplomacy with a paintbrush. But the resemblance stayed unmistakable. By the time several generations had gone by, courtiers and diplomats could pick out a Habsburg almost instantly. If a stranger stepped into the palace with that familiar forward jaw and those unmistakable family features, someone nearby would quietly murmur that here was another one of them. The trait did not stay confined to paintings either. It sometimes affected speech and chewing. Some Habsburg rulers reportedly found it hard to close their mouths comfortably, and others developed dental troubles that made eating difficult, which means royal dinners were occasionally less elegant than they appeared. Imagine the grand banquet hall. Silver plates, roasted meats, goblets of wine, musicians playing softly in a corner, nobles chatting politely as servants glide between tables bearing platters of elaborate food. Meanwhile, the king is working very carefully to chew a piece of venison without turning the evening meal into a medical ordeal. The official records rarely mention that part. And yet, despite the whispers, the portraits, and the steadily more recognizable family likeness, the dynasty carries on exactly as before. The same marriage patterns continue. The same small circle of relatives becomes the pool of royal spouses. And with each new generation, the famous Habsburg jaw quietly grows more pronounced. At first, it is merely a recognizable feature, then a dynasty trademark, and eventually a warning sign that something unusual is unfolding deep within the royal family tree. But for now, as the painted kings keep staring silently from the walls of the gallery, one thing is certain. To identify a Habsburg ruler in a crowd, simply look for the chin arriving a few seconds ahead of the rest of him. The realm now belongs to Charles V, a man who inherited so many territories that he famously remarked the sun never set on his empire. But ruling half the world brings stress, politics, and ceaseless wars. Charles V also carried the genetic legacy of centuries of intermarriage, and historians today believe he already displayed signs of the physical traits that would later come to define the dynasty. His empire grew so vast that a rider setting off westward at sunrise could still, in theory, remain inside Habsburg territory by sunset, assuming the horse did not give out halfway from exhaustion. Charles V inherits an astonishing collection of lands. Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and a swiftly expanding overseas empire in the Americas all land on his desk at once. Not literally, of course. A medieval desk would buckle under that much paperwork. But the responsibility is real. Each morning brings a palace humming with messengers. Couriers arrive bearing letters from distant governors, bishops, generals, and ambassadors. They were always the same handful of people repeated across different branches of the family tree. Court tutors taught you languages, diplomacy, and theology, but no one ever mentioned genetics, largely because the idea hadn't been invented yet. As they saw it, marrying relatives was simply a way of keeping the bloodline pure. Your morning would begin in a palace room, spacious enough to shelter several ordinary households. Light spilled through the tall windows and settled on the tapestries lining the walls, woven scenes of battles, of saints, and of ancestors who all looked oddly familiar. There was a reason for that. Study the portraits closely, and you might notice something curious. Some of the figures on the walls were not merely your ancestors, they were also your cousins. Now and then your great-uncles. On occasion they managed to be both at once, which turned any attempt to explain the family tree into something resembling a riddle worked out in a drowsy state. To everyone around you, though, none of this seemed remarkable. A servant would help you into precisely fitted clothing, the kind likely sewn by someone who had spent weeks threading slivers of gold into the cloth. Then you would be led to the schoolroom, where your tutors were already standing by. Royal children were not given an easy, unhurried childhood. What they were given was a timetable. The day opened with languages, Latin first and foremost, since any future ruler had to be able to read documents, treaties, and the texts of the church. After that might come Spanish, German, or French, the choice depending on which corner of the Habsburg holdings you were expected to govern in time. Languages gave way to diplomacy. The tutors explained how to receive ambassadors, how to keep noble titles straight, and how to offer a gracious smile even towards someone who might quietly be scheming against your family. Then theology, for to rule in that age meant ruling with the blessing of heaven, or at the very least seeming to. What never appeared on the lesson plan was biology. In the 1500s, no one was explaining the dangers of marrying cousins again and again. No one was sketching charts to show how inherited traits travel down through the generations. The belief that everyone held instead was far simpler. It was about bloodlines. Royal blood was thought to be something rare, almost holy. Kings ruled by divine right, which meant their families had to stay noble, pure, and unmixed with common stock. Marrying within royal circles was therefore not just custom, but very nearly an obligation. And because the Habsburgs already commanded such vast power, the simplest way to hold on to it was to keep marriages within the dynasty. So for a young prince or princess, the roster of possible future partners turned out to be remarkably brief. Sometimes you would meet them while still quite young. Picture a formal dinner in the palace, candles wavering along a lengthy table while nobles murmured about politics. Seated across from you was another young relative of royal blood, a cousin perhaps, or a second cousin, or possibly a cousin tied to you through two separate branches of the family at the same time. The grown-ups would look from one of you to the other and trade approving smiles. A very promising match. You might not yet grasp it, but the whole room was already turning over the question of your future wedding. This was the world in which you came of age, a place where family, politics, and power were thoroughly knotted together, where cousins became political allies and marriages were arranged to lock down thrones rather than to chase affection. And within this snug royal bubble, everything felt secure. The empire reached clear across Europe. Your relations occupied a string of thrones. The Habsburg name drew tremendous respect. Seen from the palace windows, the dynasty looked beyond stopping. No one imagined that this so carefully guarded bloodline, this proud family habit of marrying within the dynasty, would in time produce troubles that no tutor, priest, or royal advisor had yet begun to understand. For the moment, as you moved through the palace halls past portraits of familiar faces and familiar jaws, it all seemed entirely sensible. What, after all, could be safer than keeping power in the family, especially when the family amounted to nearly everyone you knew? Royal marriage was never a matter of love. It was a matter of heirs. Every king and queen carried the heavy expectation of producing healthy sons who could take up the throne. Yet with each generation of close marriages, the chances of complications crept upward in silence. The dynasty pushed on regardless, certain that this strategy was the key to holding power. So now you find yourself standing in the middle of a royal wedding. The cathedral is vast, ringing with choir music, and the low murmur of nobles draped in enough silk and velvet to ruin a small town. Candles waver against the stone walls, and the air carries a faint trace of incense and anxious ambition. You are not here for romance. You are here for the future of an empire. The bride and groom stand before the altar in carefully arranged finery, heads bowed as priests recite blessings in Latin. Ranged around them sit ambassadors, generals, bishops, and royal relatives, every one of them quietly working out the same sum. Children, sons preferably, and plenty of them. Because in a royal dynasty, an heir is more than an infant. An heir is stability. An heir keeps wars at bay. An heir assures the nobles that the kingdom will not crumble into chaos the instant the present ruler dies. Lacking an heir, Europe has a troubling tendency to burst into conflict. You have likely noticed that medieval history holds a suspicious number of wars that open with the words "after the king died" without a clear successor. No heir means rival claimants. Rival claimants mean armies. Armies mean battlefields crowded with men disputing which cousin can technically lay claim to the crown. So royal couples felt the weight of expectation from the moment the wedding feast was cleared away. Courtiers whispered. Advisors kept a close watch. And the royal physicians, who it has to be said were operating with medical knowledge that would make a modern nurse go pale, began recording every pregnancy. When a healthy son arrived, the whole court rejoiced as though the kingdom had struck it rich. Bells pealed, cannons thundered, poets dashed off wildly enthusiastic verses about destiny. But when pregnancies failed, or when children were born frail, the mood in the palace shifted in a hurry because everyone grasped exactly what hung in the balance. Within the Habsburg dynasty, this pressure grew especially fierce. Their empire spread across a number of kingdoms. Spain alone ruled enormous territories, among them fresh colonies on the far side of the Atlantic. Austria held lands all through Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire piled on yet another tangled layer of political duty. The whole of this power had to pass into the next generation, which meant every royal child was expected to carry not only the family name, but the steadiness of an entire continent. And here is where the quiet trouble began to take root. The dynasty's marriage strategy, so good at keeping power inside the family, also meant that many of these royal couples shared very close bloodlines. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The family tree folded back upon itself over and over. No one in the palace understood the science behind whatever this might bring about. The word genetics would not exist for another 2 centuries, yet people did pick up on patterns. Some royal children wrestled with health problems. Others grew slowly or stayed physically delicate. A few suffered from ailments their doctors could not account for. The court physicians did what they could. They prescribed herbal blends, prayers, careful diets, and from time to time some thoroughly dubious treatments involving leeches. None of it touched the real cause. But since the political order leaned on heirs, the dynasty went on with the very same strategy. Another cousin marriage, another royal wedding, another generation expected to deliver the flawless successor. From the outside, the Habsburg Empire still looked mighty and secure. The crown stayed in the family. The territories remained bound together through blood and marriage. Inside the palace, though, the pressure never let up. Every royal cradle bore tremendous expectations, and every newborn was met with the same unspoken question hanging over the whole court. Will this one prove strong enough to inherit the empire? Because should the answer turn out to be no, the consequences would ring out far beyond the walls of the nursery. Court painters did all they could to flatter royal faces, yet even the most gifted among them could not entirely conceal certain features. The jutting jawline, the elongated faces, the unusual proportions kept resurfacing. In the official portraits, painters smoothed the details away. But historians today, studying those very paintings, can plainly trace the genetic pattern repeating across the centuries. Now imagine that you are a court painter arriving at the Habsburg palace. This is no ordinary errand. To paint a king or queen is among the most prestigious artistic commissions in all of Europe. Your work will hang in palaces, journey to foreign courts, and stand in for the ruler before people who may never set eyes on them in the flesh. Which means your painting has to manage 2 rather delicate tasks at once. First, it has to resemble the ruler. Second, it has to make the ruler look magnificent. You are shown into a grand hall where the monarch sits waiting patiently, or at least putting on a show of it. Behind them hang velvet curtains, gilded furniture, and emblems of power, crowns, swords, globes, and banners proclaiming the enormous span of the empire. You bow politely, your brush is at the ready, and then you notice the jaw. It is not startling at first, only a touch more pronounced than usual, but when you examine the ruler's profile, the lower jaw reaches a little forward, lending the face a distinctive shape that is hard to overlook. Now the challenge becomes clear. Paint it precisely as it sits on the face, and the result may strike the court as too plain for royal taste. Conceal it completely, and the picture stops resembling the ruler altogether. A portrait that misses the mark is no small matter either. Should the king's mother gaze at the finished canvas and declare that the man before her looks nothing like her son, an artist's career might be snuffed out faster than a flame in a draughty hall. And so a middle path is chosen. The light is nudged just so. The head is set at a thoughtful tilt. Perhaps a touch of shadow eases the line of the jaw, or a sumptuous collar is added to gently pull the eye away from the chin. Painters grow skilled at this gentle juggling act. Not trickery, only a kind of artistic tact. The genuine trouble, though, emerges with the passing of time. Once a painter has rendered a handful of Habsburg rulers, an odd thing starts to register. The faces echo one another closely. You finish one archduke and reflect on his curious jawline. Years later you paint his son, and the very same jaw stares back. Then maybe a cousin, carrying that same unmistakable profile. In time you begin to wonder whether, set side by side, all your portraits would resemble mildly varied editions of a single individual, and in plenty of royal galleries to this day, that is very nearly what greets the eye. One Habsburg ruler after another gazes outward from the frames. Fashions shift across the centuries. The armour turns more ornate. The wigs swell larger. The ruffs at the throat broaden until they resemble nothing so much as a decorative dinner plate fastened to the neckline. Yet the faces remain plainly kindred. The jutting jaw, the long slim cheeks, the lips that tend to rest a little apart, because the lower jaw makes closing the mouth easily something of a problem. Today's historians and geneticists have pored over these paintings, since canvases, unlike written notes, preserve physical traits with striking clarity. And throughout those centuries of likenesses, the same trait surfaces again and again, generation upon generation. The Habsburg look. At the time, naturally, no one grasps the reason fully. There are murmurs, to be sure. Courtiers now and then trade quiet jokes about how simple it is to pick out a Habsburg from clear across a room. Diplomats note the marked family likeness in letters dispatched home to their own sovereigns. But the notion that marriage habits might be moulding the dynasty's very appearance, that idea has not yet taken hold. So the portraits go on. Another monarch, another canvas, another careful angle of the head. And somewhere within a hushed palace gallery, lingering long enough to study the faces returning your gaze from centuries of gilded frames, one might begin to catch on. The painters themselves had surely worked it out ages earlier. Within the Habsburg dynasty, the family resemblance was anything but faint. Attend a Habsburg royal wedding, and the guest list might strike you as peculiar. Almost everyone in attendance was tied somehow to the bride, the groom, or each of them. In certain cases, the family threads coiled back on themselves so intricately that genealogists today require whole charts simply to follow who counted as whose cousin. Picture yourself, then, beneath the soaring arches of a great cathedral on the morning of one such wedding. Light pours through stained glass, washing the stone floor in shades of red, gold, and deep blue. The nave is crowded with nobles in embroidered cloaks and glittering jewels, wearing expressions that hint at an hour spent trying to recall precisely how they connect to everyone else present. Because the thing about Habsburg weddings was this: they felt less like the joining of two families and more like the reunion of one enormous, hopelessly tangled one. Cast an eye down the rows of seated guests. That Duke from Spain, a cousin. The Archduchess from Vienna, also a cousin. The Prince waiting near the altar, a cousin who may double as a second cousin, depending on which branch of the tree you trace. Even the witnesses putting their names to the marriage contract are most likely relations. If that sounds bewildering, it is because it was. Even in the 1500s, royal advisors leaned on written genealogies, merely to keep the dynasty's inner links straight. Sprawling parchment charts were stored in palace archives, painstakingly recording the marriages, births, and alliances that bound the Habsburg family across Europe. Without them, arranging the next royal match would have been all but impossible. Picture the difficulty of setting up a politically handy wedding when half the eligible partners already share your great-grandparents. Somewhere in a quiet palace office, a royal genealogist sits stooped over a desk strewn with ink, quills, and scrolls. The task is to trace every noble bloodline, establishing who is related to whom and just how nearly. It resembles less a study of family history than a branch of advanced arithmetic. A typical exchange might run along these lines. Could the prince wed the princess of that branch? Well, in theory, yes, though they share two sets of grandparents. And a cousin instead. Also related through three separate lines. The Archduchess from Spain, then? Still a cousin, only a slightly different one. Eventually, someone gives a shrug and utters the phrase that seems to untangle most Habsburg dilemmas. Close enough. And with that, another marriage is settled. In fairness, the reasoning does hold from a political standpoint. Each royal wedding tightens the alliances inside the dynasty. The crowns of Spain and Austria stay bound together. The territories remain within the same extended family. And so long as the empire holds steady, no one has much cause to question the arrangement. The wedding itself is a glorious affair. Choirs lift their voices. Nobles raise toasts to the couple. Courtiers murmur about the heirs to come, who will one day inherit vast tracts of Europe. The newlyweds, meanwhile, stand still before the altar, likely aware that their union has less to do with personal joy than with the lasting steadiness of an empire. Romance is optional. Dynastic strategy is not. As the years roll on, the lattice of royal kin grows thicker still. Children arrive bearing connections drawn from several branches at once. Cousins turn into spouses. Nephews turn into political allies. Whole stretches of Europe become laced together by bloodlines that loop and wind like vines creeping up a castle wall. Seen from the outside, the Habsburg dynasty looks tremendously mighty. Its relatives sit on thrones across the continent. Its reach extends from Spain to Austria and onward. Its network of family alliances ranks it among the most commanding royal houses in all of history. Yet step back and study that knotted web of marriages with care, and one thing grows plain. The family tree is no longer branching outward, it is folding back upon itself. And everyone within the cathedral toasting this royal wedding, every beaming duke, every graceful princess, every ambassador lifting a goblet of wine, stands inside a dynasty that is slowly turning into one very large, very tangled family reunion. King Philip II of Spain carried on the custom of strategic family marriages. His unions reinforced the alliances within the Habsburg network, drawing power ever more tightly into the dynasty. But every generation narrowed the genetic pool a little further, unwittingly raising the chances of inherited conditions. You now stand within the court of Philip, one of the mightiest rulers in Europe. His empire spans Spain, large portions of Italy, the Netherlands, and immense territories in the Americas. Ships heavy with silver cross the Atlantic under his command. Whole continents answer, on paper at least, to his crown. From the outside, Philip's reign appears the very summit of Habsburg power. But within the palace, the same dynastic habit carries on quietly, almost by reflex. Marriage remains the key to all of it. Philip himself marries more than once across his life, and each match carries immense political weight. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, is no stranger from some far kingdom. She is his cousin, and more exactly a double cousin, which is to say, they share grandparents on both sides of the family. By modern reckoning, this is about as genetically close as royal marriages could get before people start eyeing the family tree with discomfort. Yet in the middle of the 1500s, the arrangement seems entirely sensible. Portugal is powerful, wealthy, and bound closely to Spain. Keeping the alliance within the extended family feels safe, predictable, and politically shrewd. The wedding is marked with the customary royal splendor, ceremonies, feasts, and hopeful expectations that the pair will bring forth strong heirs to carry the line onward. And a son does arrive, Prince Don Carlos. At first his birth is hailed like any royal arrival. Bells peal. Courtiers offer the king their congratulations. A new generation of the Habsburg line has begun. But as Don Carlos grows, those around the court start to sense that something is amiss. The prince wrestles with both physical and behavioral troubles. Accounts from the period describe him as erratic, frail, and frequently unstable. Some historians now suspect his ill health was shaped by the steadily closer genetic ties running through the Habsburg line. At the time, however, no one comprehends this. Instead, courtiers whisper of flaws in character, a foul temper, heavenly punishment, or simply unlucky fate. Physicians prescribe remedies of rest, herbs, prayers, and the occasional medical practice that very likely made matters worse. The situation grows so worrying that Philip eventually confines his own son to his chambers, afraid that the prince's unpredictable conduct might threaten the stability of the realm. It stands as a bleak reminder that dynastic politics can turn deeply personal. Yet even as these troubles surface within the royal family, the marriage strategy itself does not bend. Philip goes on arranging alliances that keep power inside the Habsburg network. Later matches knit Spain still more tightly to the Austrian branch of the dynasty. Among his best-known marriages is the one to Anna of Austria, his own niece. From the vantage of the royal court, this once again makes perfect political sense. It strengthens the bond between the Spanish and Austrian branches and ensures that command of their vast territories stays firmly in Habsburg hands. No one pauses to weigh the long-term biological consequences. After all, the empire still looks strong. The fleets still sail. The silver from the Americas still streams into Spanish ports. Diplomats still bow before the King of Spain, whose authority reaches farther than that of nearly any ruler before him. But quietly, generation by generation, the circle draws tighter. Each fresh marriage within the dynasty trims the diversity of the family line just a touch more. Each new royal child carries a heavier share of the same inherited traits from the same ancestors. None of it is deliberate. To Philip II and his advisors, they are simply safeguarding the dynasty. They are holding the empire together, the crowns linked, the bloodline royal. And for the moment, it still holds. The Habsburgs remain among the most powerful families on earth. But the family tree grows ever narrower, and the cost of that narrowing will prove far harder to overlook in the generations to follow. By the close of the 1500s, certain European observers had begun whispering about the unusual features and health troubles cropping up among Habsburg rulers. But to openly criticize a royal dynasty was a perilous business. So the talk stayed hushed, murmured in court corridors and folded into diplomatic letters. You find yourself standing in a long stone hallway of a royal palace, the sort where footsteps echo faintly and conversations are kept carefully beneath the level of a whisper. Torches waver along the walls, And not far off, a pair of nobles linger beside a window, speaking in the guarded tone people adopt when the topic might be delicate. Because by now, people have started to notice things. Nothing dramatic at first, merely observations. Familiar cast of the face that turns up again and again across different branches of the family. None of it is voiced aloud during official ceremonies. No ambassador, of course, strides into a throne room and proclaims that the family resemblance is growing extremely noticeable. That would make for a very short diplomatic career. The conversations happen instead behind closed doors, around dinner tables, once the king has withdrawn for the evening, in letters passed discreetly from one diplomat to another, in tight clusters of nobles bending their heads together beside the warmth of a hearth. The manner is always cautious, because finding fault with a reigning house, and certainly one as commanding as the Habsburgs, is a risky habit to fall into. This is a family in command of immense lands. Their kin occupy thrones throughout Europe. Their soldiers guard sprawling empires, and their webs of alliance reach from Spain across to Austria and farther still. So when the subject is the odd features showing up within the royal house, one approaches it gently. Extremely gently. Think of a foreign envoy composing a letter back to his own monarch. He wets his pen and starts to set down what he saw at the court he has only just left. The Spanish king, he writes, is stately and commanding. The palace is splendid. The empire is rich. Then, perhaps toward the close of the page, his tone shifts a little. He remarks that the members of the royal house look strikingly alike. Strikingly. Maybe he sketches the particular shape of the jaw that turns up in several of the dynasty's members. Maybe he mentions that certain royal children seem fragile in their health. He charges no one with anything, he merely records what he saw. Then the letter is sealed and carried across Europe, where a different royal court takes it in with keen attention. Before long, comparable letters start arriving from other envoys too. Dispatches out of Vienna, dispatches out of Madrid, dispatches out of Brussels, every one of them outlining the same faint regularity. At this point in history, no one truly grasps what they are looking at. The study of genetics is still 200 years away from existing. There is no one able to link repeated marriages between cousins with inherited bodily features. Yet people have a real talent for spotting recurrences, and this particular recurrence is growing hard to overlook. All the while, the Habsburg court goes on just as it always has. Royal weddings are marked with lavish ceremony. Princes and princesses arrive amid great celebration. The empire keeps running with striking smoothness, its provinces overseen by faithful officials and influential nobles. Seen from the outside, the house still looks tremendously secure. But within the hushed corners of Europe's courts, the murmurs go on. An envoy lifts an eyebrow over the course of a dinner. A noblewoman makes a soft remark about a royal portrait. A visiting physician jots down notes he cannot fully account for. None of them speak it aloud. Not yet. Because when one family holds half of Europe, faulting them is more than discourteous. It carries political peril. Even so, the talk drifts along softly, carefully, passing from one palace to the next like smoke curling down long hallways. And as each generation goes by, those murmurs swell just a touch. Because even lacking the vocabulary of modern science, a growing number of people start to sense that something out of the ordinary is taking place within the most powerful family in Europe. They simply have no idea yet how grave the trouble may turn out to be. Geneticists in our own time, poring over Habsburg genealogy, uncovered something striking. Many limbs of the family tree fold back into themselves over and over. In certain instances, a single ancestor turns up several times within one line of descent. This sharply raised what scientists term the inbreeding coefficient. Now picture an enormous wooden table in a still archive room. Spread across it lies a vast family chart reaching so far over the surface that one has to lean across it simply to trace the lines. Names are inscribed in painstaking ink, joined by branches intended to stand for the generations. Initially, it resembles any ordinary family tree. Parents give way to children. Children fan out into new families. The lines reach outward like the boughs of an oak stretching toward the sky. Only this tree does not act like a tree. Trace one branch far enough and something curious occurs. The line curves backward. A cousin weds another cousin. That marriage rejoins two branches that had already been tied together several generations before. Then their children marry yet another relation, binding the same branches once more. Soon the chart no longer looks like a tree at all. It starts to resemble a loop, or as a few historians have quipped, a genealogical pretzel. To grasp just how strange this is, imagine sketching your own line of descent. Most can follow their ancestry outward through dozens of separate people. Great-grandparents hail from different regions, different families, sometimes wholly different lands. But inside the Habsburg house, the reservoir of ancestors grows smaller and smaller with every generation. The same names surface again and again: Ferdinand, Philip, Maria, Joanna. At particular spots on the chart, one ancestor shows up several times within a single person's lineage. It is like noticing the same face appear over and over in a group photograph. Modern scientists have examined these patterns with care. By going through birth records, marriage contracts, and royal genealogies, researchers have worked out something known as the inbreeding coefficient. Now that phrase sounds rather technical, but the notion under it is plain. It gauges how closely a person's two parents are related. If two distant relations marry, the figure stays fairly low. If cousins marry, the figure climbs. If uncle and niece marry repeatedly across the generations, the figure climbs sharply. And among the later Habsburg rulers, that figure turns out to be remarkably high. Some researchers have reckoned that the genetic closeness in certain generations matched what one might expect if siblings had had children together. To be clear, siblings were not marrying within the Habsburg house, but the recurring cousin and uncle-niece unions, stretching over centuries, produced a comparable result. It is like folding a sheet of paper back on itself again and again until the layers grow extremely thick. Each generation carries more and more of the very same inherited features. And since these marriages were designed to keep power lodged within the house, the pattern carries on for decades. Royal advisors see no cause to halt it. The empire still looks steady. The crowns stay inside the family. The political machinery appears to function. From where they stand, the strategy is working. But biology is quietly keeping count. While kings and queens turn their minds to alliances and territory, something else is unfolding below the surface. The genetic variety of the house is gradually narrowing. And when variety narrows, certain features, harmful ones above all, stand a greater chance of emerging. The Habsburg court, naturally, has no means of understanding this. To them, the family tree merely stands for prestige. Every link proves how thoroughly the house is interlaced with the royal fabric of Europe. Yet if one steps back and studies that chart through a modern lens, the pattern grows unmistakable. The lines twist and rejoin. Branches fold inward. The tree no longer spreads outward into fresh families. Instead, it curls back on itself again and again until the royal family tree comes to look far less like a tree and far more like a circle. As the centuries went on, certain features kept turning up in the royal descendants. Bodily traits such as the jaw grew more pronounced. Health troubles became more frequent. But because the Habsburgs went on marrying within the same circle, the pattern only deepened. Imagine strolling through a long palace gallery late in the evening. The candles have burned down low, and the walls are hung with portraits of the house reaching back across the generations. Kings, queens, princes, archdukes, row upon row of carefully painted faces gazing out from gilded frames. At first they all seem like separate individuals, but the longer one looks, the more they start to echo one another. The same jaw shape appears once more, the same narrow face, the same lips slightly apart. It is almost like watching one portrait painted over and over, only with changes of dress and hairstyle according to the century. This is what historians now describe as the genetic echo of the Habsburg house. The traits do not surface a single time. They recur. They move down through the generations like a tune handed along through the years. And in a family where marriages keep happening within the same set of relatives, those traits grow louder with each generation. Early on, the differences are slight. A prince might have a marginally longer jaw than his father. A princess might share the same distinctive facial structure with several of her cousins. Court artists learn how to render these resemblances while still showing the ruler in a flattering light. But as the centuries roll on, the features become harder to hide. The well-known Habsburg jaw grows more pronounced. Some of the family struggle with the alignment of their teeth or with chewing. Others develop ailments the palace doctors cannot explain. Of course, the physicians of the day have no modern medicine. Their accounts revolve around humours, diet, divine favour, and the occasional unlucky alignment of the stars. If a royal child falls sick, the court doctors prescribe herbs, tonics, and now and then remedies that would make a present-day physician quietly edge toward the door. But none of these treatments reach the true reason the traits keep recurring. Because the dynasty keeps to the same marriage strategy. Every generation still holds that it is safeguarding the empire. The crowns of Spain and Austria have to stay in Habsburg hands. Political alliances have to remain within the trusted ring of relatives. Marrying beyond the house risks handing power to rival families. So the system carries on. Another cousin marriage, another carefully arranged wedding, another generation of royal children born into the same narrowing bloodline. And with each generation, the genetic echoes grow stronger. Imagine letting a pebble fall into a still pond. The ripples spread outward in widening rings. Now imagine those ripples rebounding off the edges of the pond and coming back again and again, overlapping and reinforcing one another. That is what is taking place within the Habsburg family tree. The same traits keep returning, strengthened by every new marriage inside the house. To the wider world, the Habsburg Empire still looks magnificent. Its kin sit on a number of thrones. Its armies hold vast lands. Its sway shapes the politics of Europe for centuries. But within the royal bloodline, something quieter is going on. The genetic deck is slowly being dealt again with fewer and fewer cards, and in time the consequences will grow impossible to overlook. Because when traits resound through one generation after another, with no new variety entering the family line, those echoes grow louder. Loud enough that even the most devoted courtiers, the most careful portrait painters, and the most diplomatic envoys will eventually start to notice. And the next generation of Habsburg rulers will carry those echoes more strongly than any that came before. And now we come to the most famous case of Habsburg inbreeding, Charles II of Spain. By the time he was born in 1661, the house had already passed several generations marrying relatives. Charles would inherit not only the Spanish crown, but the full genetic toll of that custom. Picture the royal palace in Madrid on a cool November morning. Servants rush along candlelit corridors, murmuring to one another as the palace doctors and midwives hurry toward the Queen's chamber. The air is heavy with expectation, because the Queen is on the point of giving birth. And when you belong to the most powerful house in Europe, the arrival of a royal child is no mere family matter. It is a political earthquake. Beyond the palace walls, church bells stand ready to ring. Courtiers cluster in the nearby rooms, making a show of sipping wine calmly while privately reckoning the future of the Spanish Empire. At this moment, Spain still commands enormous territories across Europe, across the Atlantic, and across oceans most people in the palace will never lay eyes on. The empire needs an heir, a sturdy one, because the earlier generations of Habsburg rulers have already met with too many sorrows: infants who died, sickly children, princes who never lived long enough to take the throne. So when the cries of a newborn ring through the palace chambers, a wave of relief passes through the court. A prince has been born. His name is Charles. At first, the court rejoices as expected. Messengers dash through the streets carrying the good news. Bells peal out over Madrid, and noblemen clasp hands and offer one another warm congratulations. Yet even in these first days, there is a sense that something is not quite secure. Charles is tiny and frail, and unlike most royal infants, he seems to be growing and learning far more slowly than expected. The court doctors lean over the cradle, murmuring among themselves. Faced with a puzzle they cannot solve, they fall back on the habit of their age. They guess. Maybe the child only needs richer food. Maybe the heavens were out of alignment on the night he was born. Maybe a different climate would do his body good. The trouble is that no one yet grasps what is actually at work. To find the answer, you would have to draw back and study the family from which Charles came. And once you did, the picture would leave you astonished. His father, King Philip IV of Spain, had wed Mariana of Austria, who was no distant cousin of some far-flung branch. She was his own niece, which made Charles his parents' uncle and niece, a pairing that had grown unsettlingly routine within the Habsburg line. And the matter ran deeper still. When historians and geneticists of later centuries traced his ancestry, they uncovered something remarkable. So many of the same names repeated across his family tree that, on paper, his inherited makeup looked closer to that of a child born to a brother and sister. This was not because brother had married sister directly. It came instead from cousin marriages piled one atop the next across the generations, like a cake layered far too many times. By the day Charles arrived, the dynasty's bloodline had narrowed sharply, and he was the one who bore the cost. As the years passed, the signs grew too plain to overlook. He could not walk until he was several years old. His speech came haltingly. His health stayed delicate throughout his boyhood. And then there was the trait that all could see, the celebrated Habsburg jaw. In Charles II, it reached its most pronounced shape yet. His lower jaw jutted forward so far that, by some accounts, he found chewing his food awkward and could not always bring his mouth fully shut. The painters, as ever, did what they could. They shifted the angle. They eased the shadows. But even the most devoted artists of the court could only conceal so much. None of this, though, altered the fact that mattered. Charles was king, or soon would be, because however fragile the boy seemed, The whole of the Spanish Empire leaned upon him. The dynasty that had spent hundreds of years carefully steering its marriages to guard its strength now stood face to face with a bitter irony. All that protective tending of the bloodline had produced an heir who might barely be able to carry it onward. For the moment, though, as the young prince slept in his royal cradle beneath velvet drapes and the wavering glow of candles, the court went on hoping, for the destiny of one of the world's vastest empires now rested upon a very small and very fragile king. From the day Charles II arrived, it was apparent that all was not well. Now consider what it would have meant to grow up as that child inside the royal palace of Spain. The corridors are vast, hung with tapestries, floored in gleaming marble, and lined with servants who bow as you go by. Beyond the palace walls stretches one of the greatest empires on earth. But within the nursery, the world is far smaller and far stiller, because the body at its centre is weak. As an infant, sickness comes often. Fevers rise and fade like guests no one invited. The nurses move with care around the cradle, murmuring prayers and smoothing the blankets. A single cough sends a wave of unease through the whole household. The court physicians come and come again. In the 1600s, doctors are grave men in heavy robes, with thoughtful faces and a kit of remedies, that is, let us say, eager rather than useful. They look you over with care. They feel for the pulse. They debate the balance of humours within the body, the old notion that sickness springs from a disordered mix of blood, bile, and other murky fluids no one today would care to measure. Sometimes they hand over herbal mixtures. Sometimes they advise particular diets. Now and then they produce leeches, which in that age pass for a thoroughly sensible answer to nearly any ailment. Sadly, not one of these treatments touches the true difficulty. Development comes slowly. While other royal children dash across the palace gardens, walking is a struggle. The records suggest Charles did not take his first steps until around the age of 4, and even then his movements are wary and unsteady. Speech, too, is hard. Words arrive slowly, and at times not at all. The courtiers who call on the young prince depart, carrying quiet worries they would never voice aloud. For here is the awkward truth. No one wishes to say plainly. The boy who is to be king of Spain may not be strong enough to rule it. Still, the palace keeps up the pretense that nothing is amiss. An education is begun, though it inches forward. Tutors try to teach reading, writing, and the tangled duties of kingship, but the lessons are forever broken off by sickness, by tiredness, or by days when the young prince simply cannot fix his mind on anything. And all the while, the court waits. It is always waiting. Each small gain in his health is met with enormous relief. A day free of fever counts as a modest triumph. A handful of clear sentences during a lesson might send courtiers hurrying along the corridor to bring the cheering word to the Queen. But the reversals keep coming. The famous Habsburg jaw is already plainly there, and it shapes more than his looks. The unusual build of his face makes chewing a labour. Eating certain dishes turns into a slow and deliberate affair, something the royal kitchen must quietly work around. Picture the royal table. Silver platters, roasted meats, hearty stews, and fine pastries are set before the young prince who will one day govern Spain. Yet every mouthful must be taken slowly and with care, while the doctors watch on edge and the servants stand by with softer fare should the meal grow too hard to manage. The whole empire, in a sense, is holding its breath, because Charles is no ordinary child. He is the last great heir of the Spanish Habsburg line. Should he live and father children of his own, the dynasty endures. Should he not, the great empire of Spain may slide into turmoil as rival powers across Europe rush to seize the throne, and so the palace folds him in unceasing care. Doctors keep near, servants tend to his every want, priests lift up prayers for his health. For the frail boy making his slow way down the palace corridors is no mere sickly child. He is the future of the Spanish Empire, and every cough, every fever, every difficult step reminds the court of a dreadful possibility. The dynasty that ruled half the world may now hang upon the health of one very fragile king. The jaw of Charles II became one of the most famous physical features in all of royal history. It was so marked that, by report, he had trouble chewing his food and speaking clearly. The painters did their best, yet even their careful work could not mask the striking build of his face. Now picture stepping once more into the royal portrait room. The walls are crowded with generations of Habsburg rulers, each gazing out with pride from its enormous frame. Armor catches the light. Velvet collars open like great blossoms of cloth around royal necks. Every canvas is meant to broadcast power, command, and a heaven-given assurance. And then comes Charles II. When the artists set about painting the young king, they take up the work with the same delicate tact as those before them. To paint royalty is never simply to record a likeness. It is an act of presentation. A portrait must steady allies, impress envoys, and remind all who look upon it exactly who holds the throne. But Charles poses a particular difficulty. His lower jaw thrusts forward so sharply that it throws the whole balance of his face off. The lips tend to sit a little apart, since closing the mouth in comfort is not easy. Even when he holds perfectly still for the painter, the shape of his jaw rules the picture. So the artists grow inventive. They tilt his head a touch upward. They gentle the shadows. They drape rich garments about his shoulders. Vast lace collars, velvet cloaks, weighty chains of gold to pull the eye away from the heart of the face. At times the portrait turns Charles to gaze off to one side, which handily hides the full profile. But however careful the brush, the famous Habsburg feature refuses to vanish. For Charles does not merely possess the Habsburg jaw. He carries the most extreme form the dynasty has ever brought forth. Modern historians hold that the condition reached past mere appearance. The odd alignment of his jaw made chewing hard, which meant that meals were often a slow and clumsy business. Now imagine the royal dining hall. A long table runs the length of the room, ringed with nobles, ministers, and foreign ambassadors. Silver plates hold roasted meats, stews, breads, fruits, and rare dishes drawn from across the empire. Servants slip quietly among the guests, refilling goblets of wine. At the head of the table sits the king. Charles must eat with care. Some foods are hard to chew. The talk at the table now and then falls silent while he works his slow way through a course. No one, of course, remarks on it aloud. The king's dignity must stay whole at all times. The courtiers simply press on with their talk of politics, of trade, of war, all while pretending the scene is entirely ordinary. But visitors take note. Foreign diplomats describe the king discreetly in letters sent home to their own courts. They write of his frail health, his slow speech, and yes, the remarkable form of his jaw. Such accounts travel across Europe. Before long, Charles II is known not only as the King of Spain, but as the last and most striking instance of the Habsburg family likeness. Even the court physicians sense that the king's physical state is out of the ordinary, yet their explanations stay tethered to the medical thinking of the 1600s. They lay the blame on feeble digestion, on a poor balance of bodily humours, or simply on ill fortune. The thought that generations of intermarriage might have helped shape these traits is not something anyone in the palace truly grasps. So, life rolls on as before. The king takes part in court ceremonies. He listens as advisors debate the affairs of empire. He sits for official portraits that are sent to foreign rulers as emblems of Spain's authority. But every painting, every description, every hushed murmur in the royal courts of Europe drives home the same truth. The Habsburg dynasty, once renowned for its sprawling empire and mighty alliances, now owns another unmistakable emblem, a jawline so distinctive that it passes into legend. And as Charles grows older, that famous jaw will become more than a curiosity. It will stand as a visible reminder of the centuries of family decisions that shaped the fate of the Spanish throne. For all that he wore the crown, Charles II was frequently too ill to govern in any real way. Advisors, regents, and courtiers took on much of the actual ruling. And as they did, the Spanish Empire, once among the mightiest in Europe, began its slow decline. Now picture the royal court in Madrid during one of Charles's first years as king. The palace is immense, thick with ministers, generals, priests, and diplomats passing through long halls beneath painted ceilings. Decisions of weight must be reached every single day. Wars to be negotiated, taxes to be gathered, colonies to be governed across the oceans. And somewhere within this vast engine of empire sits the king. Or rather, sometimes the king sits. Sometimes he lies down. Sometimes he does not appear at all. For Charles II passes much of his life wrestling with sickness. Fevers come and go, weariness never lifts. On some days he can attend the council, on many others he cannot. And so the government quietly bends to suit. You enter the royal council chamber. Around the table sit men of power, nobles whose titles run longer than their patience, churchmen with solemn faces, and ministers bearing stacks of papers from every corner of the empire. They begin to take up the business of state, the trade routes in the Americas, the military threats out of France, the money troubles that seem to breed more of themselves with every passing year. The king listens where he is able, yet more often the deliberations move along beside him, instead of passing through his hands. Councillors choose their words with care, steering each choice while preserving the impression that all of it descends from royal will, because the appearance of a commanding monarch has to be protected. No empire wishes the wider world to picture its sovereign as frail. In reality, a great deal of the actual governing belongs to regents, ministers, and powerful clusters of courtiers. Authority drifts softly behind closed doors as rival groups jockey to nudge the empire one way or another. If that seems somewhat tangled, that is because it truly is. Spain in the closing years of the 1600s still holds enormous lands, but the weight upon the empire is heavy. Long campaigns have swallowed vast resources. The networks of trade are stretched thin. Competing European states, France under Louis XIV above all, keep gaining strength and reaching higher. And at the heart of it all rests a king who labours merely to remain well. Picture, for a moment, one of Charles's uncommon public showings. The court assembles in grand ceremonial chambers. Nobles stand along the walls while gentle music drifts down from somewhere near the balconies. The king comes in slowly. He moves with caution, frequently held up by attendants. His weakness and frail condition are plain to anyone watching with attention. Even so, all bow low as he passes. Because in spite of everything, Charles II is still the King of Spain. The proceedings go forward precisely as custom requires. Titles are called out, petitions are laid before the throne, envoys trade formal courtesies. But beneath the splendour, everyone grasps that the genuine steadiness of the empire rests on those gathered about the throne far more than on the figure seated upon it. At the same time, hushed rumours travel across Europe. Foreign ambassadors send accounts home describing the state of things. They record the king's delicate health, the political scheming among the Spanish nobility, and the deepening doubt surrounding the dynasty's future. Because a single question shadows every diplomatic exchange. What occurs once Charles is gone? The king has no children, and should he leave no heir, the Spanish Empire, among the largest political bodies on earth, will abruptly turn into the most coveted prize in Europe. France will reach for it. Austria will reach for it. Other powers will want to keep either rival from swelling too large. To put it plainly, the instant Charles II's reign closes, Europe may find itself gazing straight into an enormous international crisis. Within the palace, though, life carries on by careful habit. Physicians watch over the king's health. Councillors keep the government turning. Courtiers uphold the refined ceremonies the Spanish court expects. But as the years roll by, the plain fact grows ever harder to overlook. The empire that once towered over Europe now leans upon a ruler who can scarcely bring his own weight down the palace halls, and the fate of that empire grows less certain with each year that passes. Doctors of the 17th century had no notion of genetics. In its place they pinned Charles's troubles on the humours, on his food, on heavenly punishment, or on foul air. Their remedies ran to potions, prayers, and now and then a dubious medical procedure. Picture yourself slipping softly into the king's chamber on an ordinary morning. The curtains are pulled to hold the room calm and dim. A faint scent of herbs, incense, and the slightly nervous perspiration of several very earnest physicians striving to seem assured hangs in the air. About the bedstand the royal doctors. They murmur to one another in careful scraps of Latin, nodding gravely as they study the fragile king. Medicine in the 17th century leans less on laboratories and more on theories that sound impressive when delivered slowly. The favourite of these centres on the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If he is worn out, perhaps the black bile is to blame. If a fever takes hold, then plainly the blood is acting up. And when none of those accounts quite fits, there is always the weather. Indeed, foul air counts as a thoroughly respectable diagnosis in the 1600s. The doctors turn all of this over among themselves, glancing now and then toward the king, who sits with patients through examinations that range from mildly uncomfortable to remarkably strange. One physician urges a special herbal blend steeped from roots, leaves, and something that may once have been a frog. Another proposes adjusting the diet. Less meat perhaps, or more meat. Views differ. Then come the treatments built around bloodletting. In that age, drawing blood from the body is thought to restore the proper balance. So the doctors might bring out a small blade or a gathering of leeches, nature's own portable medical staff. These creatures are set in place with care upon the patient, where they go about their tiny but eager labour while the doctors look on with professional contentment. From where they stand, this is fine medicine. From where Charles sits, it is most likely a long afternoon. Prayers belong to the scene as well, since the boundary between medicine and faith is exceedingly thin. In this era, priests sometimes call on the king to bless him, to ask for divine healing, or to remind everyone present that illness may form part of God's mysterious design. To be fair to the doctors, they are neither careless nor unkind. A good many of them sincerely wish to help their king. They pore over the finest medical texts within reach, argue treatments back and forth, and observe Charles attentively. The trouble is simply that the real reason for his condition lies centuries beyond their reach. They cannot perceive chromosomes. They have no grasp of inherited traits. And the notion that generations of royal cousins marrying might be shaping the king's health would strike them more as an insult than as a medical idea. So they keep hunting for answers among the tools they do understand. Herbs, diets, bloodletting, prayer, and every so often a suggestion that the king take in fresher air, which in palace terms generally amounts to opening a window and hoping for the best. Through all of it, Charles bears up with quiet patience. Royal life has never been particularly comfortable, yet the medical treatments of the 17th century lay on a special layer of inconvenience. Each fresh illness summons another consultation. Each fever invites another theory. Each physician shows up persuaded that he has at last cracked the mystery. And yet the mystery holds. Because while the doctors squabble over humours and the quality of the air, the true source of the king's condition stays buried deep within the family tree, threaded through generations of royal marriages that no one in the room fully comprehends. And until science draws level with history, the physicians of the Spanish court will go on doing what they can, blending potions, offering prayers, and now and then setting a very determined leech on the arm of the most powerful king in Europe. Charles II faced a further enormous trouble. He struggled to produce an heir. For a dynasty fixated on bloodlines, this loomed as a disaster. Lacking a successor, the Spanish throne would turn into the heart of a vast European struggle for power. Picture, then, the mood within the Spanish royal court as the years go by. Early on, people stay hopeful. Charles is still young. Royal marriages frequently take a while to yield children. Courtiers trade reassuring phrases up and down the palace halls. There is still plenty of time. But time, as it happens, tends to press forward whether empires are ready or not. Charles weds Maria Louisa of Orleans, a French princess chosen in part to soften the friction between Spain and France. The wedding is marked with tremendous ceremony, music, banquets, fireworks, and speeches about the shining future of the Spanish dynasty. Everyone smiles politely, but everyone is turning over the same thought. An heir, ideally a healthy one. Every month that arrives without word of her pregnancy quietly lifts the level of unease inside the palace. The royal physicians keep close watch on the Queen. Court officials look for any sign that a child might be on the way. As the months stretch into years, the early hope starts to thin. Rumours begin moving through the court passages. Some murmur that the king's health makes fatherhood hard. Others suggest the Queen may be unable to conceive. A handful of superstitious courtiers point to curses, ill omens, or the alignment of the planets. because in the absence of plain answers, people will invent their own. In time, Maria Louisa dies without bearing a child. Charles marries again, now to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Once more the court swells with guarded hope. Surely this time the dynasty will bring forth an heir. Surely the Spanish throne will not be left vacant. But again the years slip past. Still no child, and slowly the realization spreads through the royal court like cold air creeping through the palace walls. There may be no successor. Now, this is not merely a family matter. This is a continental emergency. Spain at this point is still among the largest empires on earth. Its holdings take in Spain itself, the Spanish Netherlands, parts of Italy, and a sprawling overseas dominion reaching across the Americas and farther still. Should Charles die without a clear heir, the question grows unavoidable. Who inherits all of that? And suddenly every royal house in Europe takes a keen interest in the health of the King of Spain. The French monarchy is convinced it holds a claim through family ties. The Austrian Habsburgs are convinced the empire ought to stay within their branch of the dynasty. Other European powers look on uneasily, hoping neither side grows too strong. Because if one ruler were to inherit the entire Spanish Empire at a stroke, the balance of power across Europe could give way overnight. Diplomats begin sending letters of mounting urgency. Secret talks unfold behind shut doors. European courts quietly weigh possible inheritance arrangements while pretending all is perfectly serene. Within the Spanish palace, the air turns tense. Councillors gather around the king more often, discussing plans for the succession in cautious language. Some put forward dividing the empire among several heirs to head off a great war. Others insist the throne must pass whole to a single ruler so that stability is preserved. Meanwhile, Charles himself goes on living at the very centre of this gathering storm. He attends ceremonies. He listens to councillors. He hears the endless talk of succession, alliances, and possible heirs, all the while aware of the uncomfortable truth. The future of the Spanish Empire hinges on something he cannot supply, and as the king grows older, the pressure rises. Europe begins bracing for what cannot be avoided. By the late 1600s, the powers of Europe were quietly making ready for the inevitable. Should Charles die without children, the Spanish Empire, one of the greatest on earth, would all at once be open to seizure. Picture the mood across Europe through these last years of Charles II's reign. Kings, princes, and diplomats watch Spain the way people watch a very fragile vase perched at the edge of a table. Everyone knows it will tumble eventually. The only question is, what follows when it does? Inside royal courts from Paris to Vienna, conversations open with the same quiet inquiry. How is the King of Spain feeling today? And no one putting that question is truly anxious about his health. They are anxious about his death, because when Charles II dies, the fate of the Spanish Empire will at once become the most important political prize in the world. Spain is still vast. Its territories reach across Europe, taking in the Spanish Netherlands and large stretches of Italy. Beyond the Atlantic, Spain commands enormous lands in the Americas, dotted with silver mines and colonial cities. Its fleets still cross the oceans, carrying the wealth that pays for armies and royal courts. Whoever inherits Spain will become, in an instant, one of the mightiest rulers on earth, which is why every major dynasty in Europe is quietly readying its argument. In France, King Louis XIV watches closely through ties of family. His grandson holds a claim to the Spanish throne. If France and Spain were joined under a single royal house, the result would be a superpower able to dominate the continent. Naturally, the rest of Europe regarded this prospect with deep unease. The Austrian side of the Habsburg family, for their part, insisted the crown belonged within their wing of the dynasty, since they carried the very same royal blood. To them, letting France absorb Spain would amount to a catastrophe of statecraft. And so the diplomats began to gather, never in the open, but in hushed rooms lined with maps and stacks of legal papers. Councillors quarrelled over centuries-old kinship, marriage agreements and rights of succession reaching far back through the generations. All of them circled the same puzzle. Who had the strongest claim to the Spanish crown? The trouble was that the answer shifted with whichever royal house you happened to ask. France gave one reply, Austria another. England and the Dutch Republic, meanwhile, feared that either result might tip the balance of power across the continent. They began searching for ways to keep any single nation from rising too high. Proposals were sketched out, secret treaties floated, and maps pored over as diplomats weighed the idea of carving the Spanish Empire into portions, parceling out separate lands to separate rulers so that no great war need follow. Yet all these schemes shared the same awkward truth. None could be carried out so long as Charles II still drew breath. So Europe held its breath and waited. Ambassadors went on dispatching their reports homeward. The Spanish king looked frail. His health was anything but certain. His physicians braced for the next bout of sickness. Every letter was studied closely by monarchs who grasped exactly what lay ahead. Within the Spanish palace, Charles carried on with his daily habits. He took part in court ceremonies when his strength allowed. His advisors brought him news from every corner of the empire. Courtiers bowed low as he made his way through the corridors. But beyond Spain's borders, Europe's patience kept wearing thinner. Armies were quietly built up. Alliances were weighed in private. And every royal court kept a watchful eye trained on Madrid. For everyone understood that the instant Charles II died, the question of who would inherit the Spanish Empire would no longer rest with letters or negotiation. It would rest with the ambitions of kings. And should those ambitions clash, the whole continent might soon find itself drifting toward war. In the year 1700, Charles II at last passed away, his life having been shadowed by sickness from start to finish. With him, the Spanish line of the Habsburg dynasty came to its close. The long experiment in marrying within the family had reached its final page. Picture, then, the palace in Madrid through those last days. The hallways hang unusually still. Servants tread quietly across the marble. Doctors come and go from the king's chambers wearing the grave, weighty looks of men who can already guess how things will end. Charles had been unwell for most of his years, but by now the sickness could no longer be concealed. His body, frail across decades, was finally surrendering the long fight. Within the royal bedchamber, candles waver beside the bed. Priests keep watch close by, their prayers a low murmur. Advisors cluster in small knots, trading whispers about matters that would ordinarily belong in the council room, because each person in the palace senses the same thing, that the moment Charles dies, everything will be different. For weeks, the court keeps its anxious vigil. The king fades further. Word of his state travels swiftly past Spain's frontiers. Ambassadors hurry letters across Europe to warn their sovereigns that the end is approaching. In Paris, in Vienna, In London, and in countless other capitals, kings and ministers read those letters with sharp attention. They had been readying themselves for this moment for years. At last, on the 1st of November in 1700, the long-anticipated word arrived. Charles II was dead. The final Spanish Habsburg had departed at the age of 38, after a life that illness had slowly stripped of strength. Inside the palace, the bells began to ring out. Courtiers put on black. Religious rites commenced without delay. Nobles passed through the halls with solemn faces, carrying out the ceremonies of royal mourning that had been observed for hundreds of years. But under the grief stirred something else, a sense of urgency. Because Charles had left a will, and that will named an heir. In one of the last political acts of his life, Charles II had selected Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, to take up the Spanish throne. Put plainly, the immense Spanish Empire was about to fall into the hands of the French Bourbon dynasty. Seen through Charles's eyes, the choice may have looked sensible. Philip was young, healthy, and bound to the royal bloodline through family ties. Spain badly needed a capable ruler after so many uncertain decades. But the rest of Europe read the situation in an altogether different light. If Philip of Anjou became King Philip V of Spain while staying closely linked to the French royal house, then France and Spain might in practice merge under a single mighty dynasty. And that prospect alarmed Europe, for such a union would forge a power greater than any the continent had ever known. Inside Madrid, however, the changeover moved quickly. Philip was proclaimed Spain's new king. The Bourbon dynasty stood poised to supplant the Habsburgs. And just like that, the royal house that had governed Spain for close to 2 centuries vanished from the throne. In some ways it was a quiet finish. There was no dramatic collapse on a battlefield, no palace overrun by rebels, no last heroic stand, only a sick king dying in his bed and a dynasty drawing softly to a close. Yet the aftermath of that ending was vast. Because while the Spanish Habsburg line may have ended peacefully in Madrid, the question of who would truly command the empire had just lit a political blaze across Europe. And before long, kings and armies throughout the continent would begin to move, ready to settle that question in the one way European powers so often knew, through war. Charles's death set off the War of the Spanish Succession. The major powers of Europe took up arms to decide who would inherit Spain's enormous empire. The struggle redrew the balance of power across the whole continent. Picture, now, the moment the news fans out across Europe. A courier rides hard into Paris with the sealed dispatch. Another reaches Vienna. Ships ferry copies of the announcement to London and Amsterdam. Royal advisers break the seals, read the words with care, and then slowly raise their eyes to their kings. The King of Spain is dead, and he has named a French prince to succeed him. First comes silence, and then the arguments. In France, Louis XIV is overjoyed. His grandson, Philip of Anjou, has just been declared Spain's new king. Should the will stand, the Bourbon family will hold sway over 2 of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Imagine Louis XIV at Versailles, ringed by marble statues and mirrors throwing back endless candlelight. The French court greets the tidings with delight. Another Bourbon now occupies a throne, and one of the most prized thrones on earth at that. But elsewhere in Europe, the mood is far cooler. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs take in the news with disbelief. They had held that the Spanish throne ought to stay within their branch of the dynasty, since they shared the very bloodline that had ruled Spain for centuries. To them, surrendering the empire to France is intolerable. At the same time, in England and the Dutch Republic, leaders begin tallying the consequences. Should France and Spain become partners under the Bourbon name, their combined strength could overshadow Europe. Trade routes might shift. Armies might swell beyond stopping. The balance of power, that fragile political arrangement, could give way entirely. And so, within months, alliances take shape. They throw their support behind a rival claimant to the Spanish throne, Archduke Charles of Austria. All at once, the matter of who becomes King of Spain ceases to be a question of royal paperwork. It becomes a question of war. And war in the early 1700s is no small affair. Imagine the continent flaring up with conflict. Armies tramp across Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain itself. Generals maneuver thousands of troops over muddy ground while diplomats scramble to hold fragile alliances together. Battles break out all across Europe. One of the war's most celebrated commanders is the Duke of Marlborough, an English general whose triumphs over French forces grow legendary. With his allies, he leads campaigns reaching from the Low Countries down into southern Germany. Whole regions turn into battlegrounds. Farmers look on as armies cross their fields. Cities steel themselves for sieges. Supply wagons clatter down dusty roads bearing food, gunpowder, and the hopes of kings who believe that winning will remake the continent. Meanwhile, Philip V, the new Bourbon King of Spain, sits uneasily upon his throne, for though he wears the crown, half of Europe is fighting to pry it from him. The war grinds on for more than a decade, 11 long years of battles, negotiations, victories, and disasters. Millions of soldiers march, thousands of lives are lost, fortresses pass back and forth, again and again, and in time, something unexpected occurs. In 1711, Archduke Charles, the Austrian candidate for the Spanish crown, suddenly inherits the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which raises a fresh difficulty. Were he to become King of Spain as well, he would command an empire nearly as vast as the one Europe had set out to deny France. In other words, the cure for the war threatened to recreate the very same illness, so the worn-out powers of Europe at last resolved to compromise. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht brings the war to an end. Philip V is permitted to keep the Spanish throne, but with one crucial condition. The French and Spanish crowns may never be joined under a single ruler. Spain holds on to its monarchy, though it gives up several territories around Europe. The balance of power is restored, more or less, and just like that, the death of a sickly king without an heir has reshaped the entire continent. One dynasty has ended, another has begun, and Europe, after years of war, settles uneasily into a new political order. All of it because the Habsburg family tree had finally run out of branches. Centuries afterward, historians and geneticists set about examining the Habsburg family tree in close detail. Their findings confirmed what observers had long suspected. Generation upon generation of close marriages had sharply raised the dynasty's genetic dangers. Picture yourself now, not in a candlelit palace, but in a hushed modern research library. The air carries a faint scent of old paper and polished wood. In place of royal advisors and court physicians, the people gathered here are historians, geneticists, and researchers equipped with laptops, notebooks, and piles of historical records. Spread out on the table before them lies the Habsburg family tree. It is immense. Try to draw it on a single sheet, and you would run out of room almost at once. The chart sprawls across page after page, crowded with names, dates, marriages, and arrows linking one generation to the next. At a glance, it seems impressive, a dynasty unfolding across the centuries. But the researchers studying it notice something odd almost right away. The same names surface over and over and over. A single ancestor turns up in several different spots within the same line of descent. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. Branches of the tree fold back into one another so often that the chart starts to look less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. Historians had suspected this pattern for a very long time. The records of royal marriages were thoroughly documented, and scholars had long remarked on how often the Habsburgs married within their own extended family. But modern genetic research lets scientists press the matter much further. By working through genealogical records, researchers can calculate something called the inbreeding coefficient, a figure that gauges how closely a person's parents are related. For most people in the world today, that figure is exceedingly small. For the Habsburg dynasty, it climbs to an alarming height. When scientists work out the inbreeding coefficient for Charles II of Spain, the outcome is striking. His degree of genetic relatedness comes out roughly as high as one would expect had his parents been siblings. Now, to be clear, Charles's parents were not siblings. His father married his own niece, which was already an exceedingly close bond. But that marriage rested atop generation after generation of earlier cousin marriages, piled one upon the next. It folds the same sheet over and over, each crease piling new thickness upon the last. With time, the hereditary material grows densely repetitive, and that very density raises the odds that damaging inherited traits will surface. Scholars who have examined the painted likenesses and the written accounts of Habsburg sovereigns have also remarked on how particular bodily features recur from one generation to the next. The renowned Habsburg jaw stands as perhaps the clearest illustration. Specialists in medicine today suspect that the trait stemmed from inherited bone structure that intensified through repeated marriages within the family. Yet the jaw was merely one sign among many. Surviving documents also speak of delayed development, frail constitutions, and difficulties conceiving among various figures in the line. With Charles II, these troubles arrive at their most striking. The pattern, to present-day scientists, now appears unmistakable. The Habsburg approach to marriage, however triumphant in the political arena, steadily narrowed the genetic variety within the house. As the years passed, this made the emergence of recessive conditions ever more probable. Put differently, the very arrangement meant to safeguard the royal lineage was quietly undermining it. None of this, naturally, was deliberate. The monarchs orchestrating these unions were convinced they were shielding their realm. Genetics, chromosomes, and inherited disorders lay entirely beyond their knowledge. Such understanding would only emerge generations afterward through figures like Gregor Mendel. History, though, can be slow to surrender its lessons. And when later researchers at last charted the complete Habsburg family tree, what they uncovered was remarkable. An empire that had once governed half of Europe had, without intending to, assembled one of the most celebrated genetic case studies ever recorded. Historians continue to pore over the Habsburg lineage even now, treating it not solely as a chronicle of politics, but as a lesson in how power, custom, and biology can intersect in ways no one foresees. For in the end, the Habsburg dynasty did not crumble over a lone battle or a single ruler. It gradually folded in upon itself, generation by generation, until the family tree itself became the heart of the tale. And so the Habsburg story closes with a curious lesson drawn from the past. A house that had perfected diplomacy, alliance, and the building of empire eventually undid itself through the very marriages it relied upon. In striving to keep their lineage intact, the Habsburgs slowly sealed themselves within it. Picture a final, unhurried walk through the corridors of a Habsburg palace. Torchlight flickers low along the stonework. Portraits of emperors and kings line the passageways, their painted gazes seeming to track each step in silence. Every face marks yet another generation that once held sway over enormous territories. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Italy, and reaches well beyond Europe itself. At the peak of their fortunes, the Habsburgs seemed to be everywhere. Their kin occupied more thrones than nearly any family in recorded history. Their dominion spanned continents. Their name bore tremendous political weight. And the means that raised this empire was strikingly plain: marriage. Rather than seizing each land by force of arms, the Habsburgs took it through wedding vows. A daughter wed in one place, a cousin joined in another. A shrewdly planned union could fold whole kingdoms into their grasp. The tactic proved so effective that it redrew the map of Europe. But tactics, much like fortresses, can harbour concealed flaws. Each time the house selected a partner from inside the same family circle, the reservoir of genetic variety shrank a little further. Early on, the consequences were faint. Familiar countenances, shared features, that distinctive Habsburg jaw turning up in portrait after portrait. Before long, the indications grew harder to overlook. Ailments appeared with greater frequency. Certain royal children found it hard to develop as expected. Trouble conceiving became more widespread among the later Spanish Habsburgs. Even so, the system carried on because in political terms it delivered. The crowns remained within the family. The alliances held firm. The dynasty kept its vast power across centuries. Yet biology pays no heed to political reasoning. While kings and queens fixed their attention on sustaining the empire, the family tree was quietly curling inward. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. The same forebears surfaced over and over down the generations. And in time, the house confronted a difficulty that no treaty could mend. The last Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, could not father an heir. With no one to follow him, the line came to an end. In that manner, the centuries-old dynasty that had reigned over Spain fell away. Not by invasion or uprising, but by the gradual aftermath of its own design. In a sense, the conclusion is oddly hushed. There is no climactic last stand, no fortress tumbling down, no furious crowd surging at the palace gates. There is only an ailing king passing away in his bed in the year 1700 and a family tree that has finally exhausted its branches. Still, the account leaves a lasting reminder. History brims with empires raised upon ingenious notions. Some lean on military might, others on commerce, diplomacy, or shrewd political bargains. The Habsburgs raised theirs through marriage, and for a great while it succeeded beyond anything that might have been expected. But every strategy meets its boundaries. In labouring so intently to keep their lineage pure, the Habsburgs fashioned a dynasty wound so tightly that at last it had nowhere left to expand. Their family tree did not branch outward into fresh growth. It coiled inward until, one day, the final leaf drifted quietly to the ground. As the early 1700s approached, observers across Europe were beginning to piece things together. ambassadors, doctors, and chroniclers quietly remarked that the Habsburgs seemed unusually given to sickness, infertility, and singular physical features. The vocabulary of genetics did not yet exist to account for it, but the pattern was plain enough to see. The royal portraits resembled one another generation upon generation, and tales of delicate princes and ailing kings had grown almost commonplace. Something in the dynasty's marriage practice was clearly not unfolding as they had wished. Picture sitting in a hushed study somewhere in Europe around those early 1700s. The candles have burned down low. Papers lie strewn across the desk. Dispatches from ambassadors, notes from physicians, copies of royal genealogies reaching back through the generations. You are far from the only one poring over them. All across Europe, inquisitive minds have taken up the same pursuit. Ambassadors weigh accounts from one court against another. Physicians murmur about peculiar cases they have encountered while tending royal patients. Historians, sifting through dynastic records, start to detect patterns that prove difficult to set aside. For when the evidence is laid out one piece beside another, the parallels grow vivid. Portraits from the Habsburg courts look remarkably alike. The same facial framework returns. The same jawline reappears time and again, sometimes faint, sometimes boldly marked. At first glance, one might brush this aside as ordinary family likeness. Families, after all, frequently share traits. But the Habsburg resemblance runs deeper than that. Accounts of royal children spanning several generations recount similar stories. Princes who matured slowly, young heirs who wrestled with illness, kings who struggled to have children of their own. Taken one at a time, each instance might pass as a stroke of misfortune. Gathered together, they begin to resemble a pattern, and people are remarkably skilled at spotting patterns. Imagine two diplomats conversing in low voices after a meal in some palace in Vienna or Paris. One brings up the fragile health of Charles II. Another recalls comparable stories of earlier Spanish princes. Someone else remembers a portrait in which the famous jaw looked almost exaggerated. Soon, the talk edges toward an uneasy possibility. Perhaps the dynasty's habit of marrying close kin carries consequences. No one, of course, frames it in those exact terms. The language of genetics has yet to be invented. Gregor Mendel, the monk who would one day uncover the fundamental rules of inheritance, has not even been born. But the suspicion lingers all the same. Something about these repeated marriages inside one family circle feels unwholesome. Naturally, voicing such a thing aloud would still be perilous. Royal houses do not care to be examined like specimens in a medical record. Diplomats still measure their words, and physicians stay guarded when speaking of a king's health, yet the observations keep spreading quietly. Letters pass between courts describing royal maladies. Historians assembling genealogies begin to note how often Habsburg marriages bound together cousins, uncles, and nieces, or other near relations. And once the pattern is seen, it becomes hard to unsee, for the dynasty's history reads almost like one long experiment. Generation after generation repeating the identical marriage strategy, generation after generation displaying similar traits and similar troubles. By the time Charles II dies in 1700, the pattern seems almost obvious in hindsight. The Spanish Habsburg line has ended with no heir. The final king was physically frail. The dynasty's celebrated features had grown more pronounced with each passing generation. No one can say precisely why. But many are beginning to suspect the reason. And so, little by little, the Habsburg story shifts from a saga of imperial might into something quite different. A cautionary tale. A reminder that even the mightiest dynasties on earth cannot slip past the quiet laws of nature. Kings may marshal armies, sign treaties, and govern sprawling empires. But the rules of inheritance, whatever their workings, hold true even for royalty. Should you wander through a museum today and study portraits of the Habsburg rulers, you might notice something curiously consistent. The lips sit slightly apart. The chin appears intent on entering the room ahead of the rest of the face. Painters tried to ease the effect with angled lighting and stately poses, yet the likeness across the generations is unmistakable. What makes it all the more intriguing is that these portraits were never meant to lay bare any flaws. They were meant to exalt the rulers. And still, for all the artistic cleverness, the family resemblance stayed impossible to conceal. Now picture stepping into one of those quiet museum galleries. The lighting is gentle. The room is calm, very nearly silent, save for the faint scuff of shoes across polished floors. Along the walls hang immense portraits set in gilded frames, paintings that once adorned royal palaces throughout Europe. You start moving slowly past them. At the outset, they look like any other royal gallery. Kings clad in armour, queens in embroidered gowns, velvet cloaks, jewelled crowns, and expressions carefully composed to convey power, wisdom, and perhaps a faint suggestion of divine favour. But the longer you linger, the more something starts to repeat. The faces begin to seem familiar, not identical, of course. Each ruler belonged to a different era. Hairstyles shift with the fashions. One king wears a dramatic lace collar, resembling a decorative dinner plate. Another keeps a neatly trimmed beard. Later portraits show towering wigs that appear to lend several inches of authority, but underneath the changing styles, the same structure emerges again and again. The jaw juts forward a touch in one portrait. In another, it is more pronounced still. In certain paintings, the lips stay parted, as though the subject had paused mid-sentence, and the artist fixed the moment forever. Once you catch sight of it, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You move along from one painting to the next. There stands Charles V with the familiar Habsburg profile. Then Philip II, whose jaw seems to follow the same family template. Later, another Habsburg archduke turns up with a nearly identical cast to his face. And at last, near the gallery's end, you reach Charles II of Spain. Here, the famous feature attains its most dramatic shape. The lower jaw reaches noticeably forward, the lips parting on their own because closing them with ease is difficult. Even with careful lighting and ornate royal attire, the structure of the face commands the portrait. And bear in mind, these paintings were never intended to expose any imperfection. Quite the reverse. Royal portraits were in essence political advertisements. Their aim was to present the ruler as strong, noble, and beyond question worthy of the throne. The artists were accomplished professionals who knew exactly how to flatter their subjects. They softened shadows. They adjusted posture. They used garments and accessories to steer the viewer's eye toward emblems of power rather than physical particulars. And yet, despite every one of these methods, the family resemblance refused to vanish, because painters could alter the lighting, but they could not remake the king's skeleton. What renders these portraits so fascinating now is that they unwittingly recorded centuries of dynastic history. Each painting recorded the ruler's physical likeness with enough precision that researchers and scientists today can return to them hundreds of years afterward and study what they show. Without intending to, the Habsburg portrait collection turned into a visual diary of the family's genetic history, a chronicle the painters almost certainly never understood they were creating. People who walk through these galleries now tend to remark on exactly what the earliest viewers noticed long ago, one ruler after another, across the generations, sharing strikingly alike features. And on the way out, a single quiet thought tends to settle in the mind. The Habsburg line devoted hundreds of years to safeguarding its blood, and the portraits confirm that the effort worked, perhaps rather too well. Long afterward, scientists turned modern genetic methods toward the Habsburg ancestry. Once researchers charted the family connections, they uncovered something striking. The amount of inbreeding among the later Habsburgs matched what would be predicted for the offspring of siblings. That isn't to say siblings were wedding one another outright, but repeated unions between cousins and between uncles and nieces, generation upon generation, had gradually weighted the genetic odds in one direction. A choice that began as political calculation had quietly become a biological snare. Now picture moving forward several centuries. The candle-lit palace archives have vanished. The court physicians with their leeches and their notions about bodily humours have given way to laboratories, published studies, and scientists who pass their days exploring the silent mathematics of inheritance. Rather than ink-stained genealogists sketching family charts onto parchment, today's researchers open vast digital collections of historical material, records of births, marriage agreements, galleries of portraits, royal letters. Once all of this is brought together, the Habsburg family tree can at last be charted in remarkable detail. And as scientists start following the lines, something striking emerges. The branches keep curling back into one another over and over. At first it seems bewildering, a maze in which every route leads back to the same handful of names. Yet with modern instruments, researchers can work out precisely how frequently those loops appeared, and the figures startle even the specialists. Each time two relatives have children together, the likelihood rises that particular inherited traits, especially the rare or harmful ones, will surface. Ordinarily, within large populations, genetic variety scatters such traits widely so that they seldom cause trouble. The Habsburg line, however, did something out of the ordinary. Rather than broadening their family tree with fresh branches, they kept turning it inward. Think of shuffling a deck of cards. Keep adding new cards, and the deck grows unpredictable and varied. But keep reshuffling the same small stack again and again, and the identical combinations begin showing up repeatedly. That, in essence, is what befell the Habsburg genetic deck. Across the generations, marriages between cousins, unions of uncle and niece, and other close family arrangements steadily concentrated the same inherited traits. Each generation tipped the odds a little further, until in time the line arrived at the era of Charles II. When modern geneticists studied his ancestry, they found something striking. The degree of genetic relatedness throughout his family tree was exceptionally high, on par with what might turn up in the child of siblings. Once more, this does not mean that siblings themselves were marrying within the dynasty. It was instead the accumulated result of repeated close marriages stretching across centuries. It resembled folding a sheet of paper time after time until the layers grew thick and stiff. By the moment Charles II came into the world, the dynasty had unwittingly produced a biological bottleneck. And the signs historians had noted for so long, fragile health, difficulty having children, and unusual physical features, abruptly made scientific sense. The well-known Habsburg jaw probably grew more pronounced, as inherited skeletal traits recurred down the generations. Developmental troubles and health problems may have arisen because certain recessive genetic conditions were more apt to appear within such a closely linked lineage. Put another way, the approach that had once looked politically inspired had quietly set a biological trap. The Habsburgs were convinced they were defending their empire by keeping authority within the family. Yet in doing so, they also kept reusing the same genetic material. And biology, unlike politics, follows rules that allow no bargaining. Now the Habsburg line is examined not only by historians, but by geneticists, anthropologists, and medical researchers. Their account has become one of history's most celebrated illustrations of how patterns of dynastic marriage can shape health down through the generations. It serves as a reminder that even the mightiest families on earth cannot slip past the silent laws inscribed within every human cell. Kings may direct armies, empires may span continents, but inheritance, genuine biological inheritance, obeys rules far older than any throne. And where the Habsburgs were concerned, those rules waited patiently for centuries before science at last spelled out what history had been trying to reveal all along. The Habsburg tale points to an odd truth about power. Kings and emperors could marshal armies, redraw borders, and govern enormous empires, yet they could not give orders to biology. For hundreds of years, the dynasty believed that holding its bloodline under tight control would safeguard its power. In truth, nature pays no heed to crowns, thrones, or imperial titles. The same genetic rules bind emperors and peasants alike. And little by little, generation after generation, those rules overtook them. Now picture standing within the throne room of a grand European palace. The chamber is built to drive home one idea with perfect clarity. Whoever sits upon that throne wields tremendous power. Marble columns climb toward painted ceilings. Enormous tapestries portray triumphs in battle. Gilded ornaments catch the glow of hundreds of candles. At the hall's distant end sits the king. When he speaks, armies advance. Laws shift. Whole provinces may be won or lost with a single stroke of the pen. In the age of empires, rulers such as the Habsburgs held immense forces in their hands. They struck treaties that reshaped Europe's borders. They directed soldiers across continents. Their choices steered trade routes, religions, and the destinies of millions. In short, they appeared all but unstoppable. And that feeling of mastery coloured how the dynasty regarded everything, marriage included. As they saw it, governing the bloodline was merely one more political tactic. Much as they could broker alliances between kingdoms, they could broker alliances within their own household. A cousin here, a niece there, one more carefully selected relative who already belonged to the royal web. Each marriage looked as though it reinforced the dynasty. Each wedding kept intact the empire's delicately balanced network of alliances. To the kings and queens arranging these matches, it felt like masterful diplomacy. What escaped their notice was that they were bargaining with a force far older than politics. Biology, unlike rival kingdoms or scheming nobles, cannot be won over with treaties. It does not sit at diplomatic tables. It does not bow to royal command. It simply keeps to its own quiet rules. Picture two farmers in a small village of the same period. They too know nothing of genetics, yet experience has taught them something. When families in small communities marry too closely over many generations, certain traits begin to show up more often. Animals bred within small herds sometimes turn out weaker. Plants raised from the same narrow stock struggle to flourish. Farmers see these things long before scientists can account for them. Inside royal palaces, though, that sort of practical wisdom rarely makes its way to the throne room. Instead, the Habsburg line leans on political reasoning. If marrying within the family keeps the empire steady, then it must be the right course, and for a long stretch that reasoning appears to hold. Their empire grows, their relatives occupy thrones across Europe. Their house remains one of the continent's mightiest ruling families for centuries. But quietly, something else is unfolding out of sight. Each generation narrows the genetic pool. Each cousin marriage folds the family tree a little further inward. Early on, the effects are faint. Familiar faces, shared features, minor health troubles that might be brushed off as misfortune. Then the signs deepen. Frail heirs, trouble-bearing children, unusual physical features cropping up again and again. By the time Charles II is born, the dynasty has unknowingly reached the boundaries of its strategy. All the political genius in the world cannot rewrite the basic rules of human inheritance. The kings who once commanded armies and ruled continents come up against a problem that power cannot solve. Because the laws of biology weigh equally on everyone, emperors, farmers, peasants, princes. The same unseen mechanisms govern every human body, no matter how many crowns rest in the family treasury. And over the span of centuries, those rules quietly overtook one of the most powerful dynasties Europe had ever known. Not through a battle, not through a rebellion, but through something far simpler, a family tree that slowly folded in upon itself until even an empire could not break free. Seen from today, the Habsburg dynasty almost feels like a vast historical experiment, one carried out without anyone realizing it across hundreds of years. Their ambition molded Europe. Their marriages redrew political alliances. Their empire once reached across continents. And yet, by striving so hard to keep their family line pure, they unintentionally bred the very weaknesses that would finish it. It is a reminder that history is not shaped only by wars and treaties. Sometimes it is shaped by wedding invitations. Now picture stepping back to take in the whole Habsburg story from a distance, not from within a palace or a throne room, but from centuries onward, where historians quietly assemble the curious puzzle of this dynasty. On the surface, the Habsburgs stand out as one of the most successful ruling families Europe ever produced. Their approach was brilliant in its plainness. Rather than overpowering every neighboring kingdom through endless wars, they forged alliances through marriage. A princess wed a prince. A cousin inherited a throne. One carefully arranged wedding could draw whole territories into the family network. And it succeeded. For generations, the Habsburgs widened their reach across Europe. Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and far-flung lands overseas all came under their sway at different points in history. Their family spread so far that one famous saying captured their strategy exactly. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. But like so many clever schemes, it carried a hidden flaw. Because each of those marriages that fortified the empire politically also drew the family circle tighter biologically. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The dynasty kept turning inward to hold on to power. At first, it resembled success. The empire grew stronger. The family tree stayed firmly bound to the same royal bloodlines. The Habsburg name grew nearly identical with European power. But biology, as we now understand, operates differently from diplomacy. When families marry again and again within the same small ring of relatives, the variety of inherited traits dwindles. Harmless characteristics may repeat, but so may harmful ones. As time passed, the dynasty started to show the signs. The famous Habsburg jaw grew more pronounced. Certain health problems appeared more frequently. Some heirs struggled to live past childhood. Others met with difficulty producing heirs of their own. Still, the system carried on because no one of that era grasped why these things were occurring. From the vantage of the kings and queens arranging marriages in the 500s and 1600s, the strategy still looked perfectly sensible. Keeping power within the family was the safest political option on offer. The irony, of course, is that the very policy meant to preserve the dynasty ultimately helped bring about its close. By the time Charles II of Spain was born, the genetic deck had been stacked through generations of intermarriage. The frail king, who battled illness throughout his life, marked the final chapter of a pattern centuries in the making. When he died without an heir in 1700, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty came to an end, not through a dramatic toppling of castles or a last defeat on the battlefield, but through something quieter, a family line that simply could not go on. In hindsight, the Habsburg story feels almost like a slow-motion experiment that history conducted without ever realizing it. A powerful dynasty pursuing a course that looked entirely sensible in political terms, while never realizing it was drawing biological boundaries that would, in time, return to claim them. And perhaps that is the most remarkable lesson buried within their tale. We tend to recount the past through battles, uprisings, and the choices of mighty rulers. Yet now and then the things that mold the future are far smaller. A marriage agreement put to paper in a hushed chapel. A royal wedding marked with music and flowing wine. A family tree that gradually curls in on itself across the centuries. And tucked somewhere among all those invitations and meticulously planned alliances, the destiny of one of Europe's grandest dynasties was being settled, almost without notice. And now, at last, the palace falls still. The candles in the great halls have burned down low, their flames dwindling to gentle dots of gold against the stone. The courtiers have wandered off toward their rooms. The scribes have laid their quills aside, and far below in the palace kitchens, the final pots of evening stew sit cooling near the hearth. It has been a long passage through the curious, glittering realm of the Habsburg line. There were candlelit corridors where kings governed empires reaching across whole continents. There were royal weddings positioned like pieces upon a chessboard, every union meant to lock in power, alliances, and land. And there was the way each new generation believed it was safeguarding something sacred, a dynasty built to endure for all time. But history, as it so often does, had different intentions. For all their crowns, their armies, their palaces, the Habsburgs remained human after all. They fretted over heirs, over rivals, over keeping the family name alive in a world where power might vanish in a single night. Their answer seemed straightforward, at least to them. Hold the bloodline near. Keep the throne inside the family. Keep it all firmly in hand. And for a time, the plan held. The empire expanded. Their reach spread across Europe. Their name grew into one of the mightiest the world had known. Yet little by little, almost silently, the price began to show itself in the portraits, in the illnesses, in frail kings and doubtful successors, until at last the great Spanish branch of the family simply came to an end. Not through some sweeping battle or a castle reduced to rubble, only a sickly king, a quiet passing, and an empire left without a tomorrow. And still, even within this odd and faintly unsettling chapter, there is something profoundly human about it. For behind the crowns and the titles stood people doing what people have always done, striving to shield their families, striving to keep their grip on power, striving to steer the future as best they understood how. Sometimes shrewdly, sometimes less so. So tonight, surrounded by the comforts of the present age, modern medicine, and a family tree that with any luck does not resemble a tangled loop of wiring, there may be reason to pause and admire just how far the world has travelled. Because history can be untidy, peculiar, and on occasion graced with royal chins of truly legendary scale. Yet it is also the account of how we came to learn, slowly and imperfectly, from all that went before. And now the palace lights dim, the halls sink into silence, the dynasty fades into one more whisper within the long, winding tale of history. And so, tonight, the path of almost any family tree is a good deal simpler than a Habsburg's ever was. Good night.